So is it tough to get by with the language barrier in Colombia? Hi all, I'm Isrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So I've done a lot of videos about practical advice in Colombia, but perhaps one of the biggest hurdles that for some reason often gets left out of the conversation is language. The language barrier is definitely something worth considering, particularly if you're planning on living in Colombia, so I thought I'd tackle the topic today. Now this video actually came as a suggestion from a commenter on a previous video who wanted to know whether I'd been learning Spanish before I visited the country, so thank you to that person for that idea. With that in mind, I thought I'd share with you my own experiences in getting by with the language while living in Colombia, and hopefully from that you'll get a bit of an idea as to what to expect. So I first started learning Spanish at the beginning of 2019. At the time I had several Colombian friends who were living in Australia, and I found that they often talked in Spanish among themselves, which made me feel a little bit excluded from the conversation as I had no idea what they were saying. After a while of this happening, it incentivized me to try learning the language for myself, so I did what a lot of people do and installed Duolingo on my phone. I'm sure most of you already know, but Duolingo is basically an educational app where they have full courses for learning any popular language, along with a handful of less common languages. Being probably the largest company in the virtual education space for language, they've done a whole lot of R&D for their courses and have got their teaching strategies down to a real science. The way you learn is very ordered and systematic, which is a learning approach I very much strive with, as I am absolutely a creature of habit. Like once I get something locked into a routine, I'm extremely stubborn with it, probably to a fault, because if something isn't working, I'll still stick with it to the bitter end. In the case of Duolingo though, this has thankfully been a good thing, as it's truly taught me so much and has brought me to a level where I can comfortably hold semi-complex conversations with Spanish speakers. Now I could go on talking about Duolingo, but I'm actually going to save that for another video, as I wanted to do an in-depth review once I've 100%ed absolutely everything in its Spanish course, which I'm guessing will probably take me another year or so, but I digress. So I was practicing Spanish on Duo for 3 years for about half an hour a day on average before I came to Colombia at the beginning of 2022. And after staying in the country for 6 months, there were two things I found. One, I could pretty much ask just about anything I needed to anyone and hold conversations with my friends, no problem, but two, understanding people, particularly people who weren't friends, was like 5 times harder than speaking. Now don't get me wrong, simple exchanges at restaurants or shops or with any kind of service worker were mostly a breeze, but when it came to things like being in a taxi where the taxi driver is monologuing to me non-stop, I really did get lost in those situations and couldn't make out what was being said beyond just the general topic. I think part of this issue stems from the fact that when you talk, you can usually find a way to use the words and the grammar that you've learnt to construct a sentence for what you want to say, even if your vocabulary and grammatical knowledge aren't as robust as they are in your native language. When it comes to people talking to you though, they can freely use a bunch of words and grammar that you haven't learnt yet, leaving you totally lost. It ends up being this fill-in-the-blanks game where you hear some words and some grammar that you understand, but they're spaced out between a bunch of other stuff that's foreign to you, and so you're just having to use the limited stuff you did comprehend as clues as to what they might be saying. Then another factor is of course the accent. Now, Colombians on the whole do have accents that are relatively easy to understand compared to other Spanish-speaking countries, despite the fact that it can vary from region to region. The only time I found a noticeable difference though was when I was on the Caribbean coast. Over there, I found people to have actually an accent more akin to Venezuelans, where they don't tend to pronounce their consonants as audibly. They also tend to speak a bit faster on the coast than elsewhere. I don't know if that's just because they're more extroverted or something else, but that brings me to yet another reason why understanding people can be difficult. They don't often slow down for you. This is the most frustrating factor for me personally, but I found that it's not so common for people to slow down when talking with foreigners, even if you ask them to. To be fair, this is probably an issue in most countries around the world to varying extents, and I think ultimately it comes down to the individual person you're talking with and how perceptive they are. I do find though that the more people have brush shoulders with cultures other than their own, the more intuitive this is to them. With this in mind, one difference I'd note between Colombia and my own country is the level of multiculturalism. In Colombia, there really aren't many non-Latin American immigrants as there are in Australia or the US or most first world Western countries. There's a bit of a US and European population in parts of Medellin, and you can run into a lot of tourists if you're visiting a touristy site or town, but unless you're living in one of these places, you'll often feel like you're the only non-Latin American around. And this is reflected in the day-to-day life of most Colombians as well, as for many, the only people they've ever seen outside of South America are the odd tourists or expats, as opposed to a whole chunk of immigrants from around the world. So to bring this back to having conversations, what this means is that for many, they're not as accustomed to meeting foreigners as you or I might be. Because of that, in many cases, the thought of slowing down or using more simplistic words when talking with non-native speakers doesn't come as intuitively, as it's not something they've experienced hundreds of times before. It's kind of funny because it reminded me of all the times where I've slowed down to talk to foreigners who have a basic English level in my own country, and I'd always be wondering whether I sound patronizing speaking to them like a toddler, but now that I've been on the receiving end, I can say wholeheartedly that you really do cherish the moments when people speak to you this way, as it helps so much. Anyway, with all this talk about how hard it can be to understand people, I've probably oversold it somewhat, so I also just want to reassure you that I really am only talking about conversations with strangers who you're only with briefly. I find that if you spend a lot of time with someone, it means you have time to overcome any initial language barrier and mutually configure the conversation to a level of Spanish you're most comfortable with. If you get to know someone personally, they're going to eventually pick up on how well you understand them and will communicate at a level you feel comfortable with. I can say that I rarely had any trouble understanding my friends when they were talking to me, although admittedly when they started talking among each other, that was a little more of an issue. Also, I noticed when my Colombian friends send me voice messages, they really don't hold back when it comes to that, but in person it's a different story. So I've talked a bit about my own experience, but you might be wondering how well you need to speak Spanish to get by in Colombia. And to this, I think there's a saying that applies quite aptly, and that is that you only get out what you put in. So if you're wondering how much you should put in, you should first ask yourself how much you want to get out. If that was too cryptic, what I'm trying to say here is that if you want a life embedded in Colombia where you're living there long term and experience lifelong relationships with Colombian people on a very deep level, then yeah, you'll want to work pretty hard on your Spanish. If you're just visiting for a couple of weeks though, for a brief cultural experience though, and only need to know the essential things to get by, then you obviously don't need to learn a whole lot. If you're someone who falls into this latter category, I'd maybe recommend just practicing on Duolingo for a little bit before you go. Obviously, the longer you do this in advance, the better, but as a bare minimum for people who are just visiting for a short period, I'd say practicing for a month in advance should get you to a level where you can get by with a few essential phrases. Of course, this isn't necessarily applicable if you already know some Spanish. Like, if you feel like you've already got the basics down, then you're probably already good to go. For those in the former group though who want the deepest immersion possible, honestly, the best time to start learning was yesterday, but the second best time is today. So I'd highly recommend getting onto it if you haven't already. The more Spanish you speak, the more you're going to be able to connect with Colombians. Now, as someone with a 4-year+ streak on Duolingo, I do truly believe this is a great way to learn for those wanting to dive deep into the language as well. I'm also realizing now that once you get to an upper intermediate level, it is beneficial to try some other strategies too, like reading Spanish articles, listening to Spanish spoken podcasts, or watching movies in Spanish. Movies in particular, I find offer a real challenge, as I have a hard enough time understanding English movies without subtitles a lot of the time. I don't know, I find in modern movies, people are often speaking under their breath or just too far away from the mic, unlike the older movies where they had to speak louder and right up close to the mic to be heard. I mean, I suppose when it comes to a Spanish dub of a movie, they just have people doing VO in a booth, so they probably don't have those same issues, but then again, they might mess around with it in post to match the original performance. Anyway, I'm getting on a tangent, but point is, watching movies in Spanish is like a top tier challenge. If you can understand an entire movie in Spanish, congratulations, you're probably fluent. Now, I did want to preface this by saying that all of these extra resources like movies, podcasts, and articles, I wouldn't say are as necessary if you're in the earlier stages of learning the language. In my opinion, I think it's better to get a hold of the foundations of the language before you start looking into these things, as without that, you're going to be pretty lost. Like, you can't analyze something if you have no point of reference. It'll just end up being a blank page instead of a fill in the blanks. Anyway, I hope I provided a bit of insight on what to expect regarding the language in Colombia, and maybe even helped inspire you to start learning Spanish for yourself if you haven't already. As always, if you enjoyed this, feel free to like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!